you for joining us this evening. My name is Chris. I work for the Reading Agency and I'm on the Reading Partners team, and we run the Reading Agency Presents series. And I'm joined by Tom Watson, who is the author of Metronome. So I will leave links in the chat for you to go and have a look at that. That's the hardback, which I don't know why, but it looks a bit blurry. One second. So Tom was awarded the Curtis Brown Prize in 2018, and his fiction's been shortlisted for the Bristol Short Story Prize, and he received an honourable mention in the Berlin Writing Prize, and was also awarded runner-up in the Sean O'Phelan Short Story Competition. This is his first book, Metronome. It was published by Bloomsbury in 2021, and it was chosen as a BBC Two Between the Covers book club pick. I'm going to kick off, and I'm going to ask if you can tell us a little bit about Metronome, and if you can just also talk us through where you actually got the idea from.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining this evening. It's good to see a copy of the hardback there, Chris. I've got like the paperbacks coming behind. So yeah, Metronome is my debut novel, and it's about a couple who are imprisoned on this remote island. And they begin to suspect that they've been abandoned by their warden. They disagree about what to do next, and their love and their loyalties begin to be tested a little bit. So Aina starts, looking for ways that she might escape, and her distrust of Whitney starts to grow a little bit. So she ends up keeping some secrets of her own, and this kind of distrust between them starts to play out a little bit more. So it's very much like when I was thinking about, okay, what am I going to put in this novel? I had like three things at the forefront of my mind. The first was I wanted it to be about a couple. I wanted that relationship to be front and center. So I just wanted to have like a very, when I started putting pen to paper on it, it was like this couple in a room having a chat, talking about stuff, drinking cups of tea, things like that. So I had this couple, and then it was always going to be a slightly bizarre prison. So in terms of what I wanted for them, it was going to be something that was tailored specifically for them, and that's how they ended up on this island. The island is itself a prison for them. So I was kind of thinking a little bit about all the various sort of ways you can be in prison, the various prisons that we've seen through history and we've seen in fiction plenty. And so thinking about various quotes like "hell is other people," and thinking of Orwell a little bit, and Room 101. And so I wanted to make this kind of prison tailored for them specifically. So the novel is about how those things play out a little bit. When it comes to things like Orwell, I think they've obviously committed a crime, so this is their punishment for it. And it wasn't too long ago that I was rereading part of 1984 and thinking about Winston's version of Room 101 and the rats, and I couldn't help but not be overly terrified by it. I think partly, I don't know, the rats just didn't seem particularly terrifying anymore. So I think maybe like I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here kind of watered down the effect of the rats. So I spent a bit of time just thinking what would be the worst thing in the world for this couple. And it was to be in a situation where they begin to doubt each other, and to sort of see the seeds of that kind of mistrust kind of spread among their life. They've been on this island living in a croft for 12 years, so they've got very used to this situation. And the third thing that I had in mind when I started it was the setting. From the very get-go, it was going to be this prison, this couple. They were going to be living on moor of some sort. So it wasn't an island to begin with, but it was very much cut off. It was a moor. So that setting, very sort of, moors have always terrified me. I don't really, whether it's Gothic literature or something like that, but there's always been a place for moors where they just freak me out. There's that element of just things that seem far away but are actually further. Like you can, the sense of distance and the sense of time that it might take to travel somewhere, and the distortions that it brings. So those were the sort of the three things that I had in mind when I started writing it, I think. So I can't hear you, Chris.
I muted myself. That's a great start. This is why I have the coffee people that are watching at home. No, that's amazing. And I think that's really interesting when we think of prisons. We do have, like, if you ask anyone to kind of give an idea of a prison, they think of the bars, but they don't think of the idea of like an island and how that kind of plays into, or what that prison is tailored to that person's fears and desires. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I just want to jump back because I forgot to say to people, if you do want to leave a comment or just, let us know where you're joining us from, you can do that in the chat. And if you want to leave a question, as I'm sure I can see some of you have already left questions, you can just use the Q&A. The next question I wanted to ask was around Whitney and Aina. So they're both very, very different, both very distinct. And I kind of want to know what it was like to write those characters, but also did you find yourself gravitating more towards one or leaning more towards one character?
Yeah, I mean, from the get-go, Whitney was the slightly more annoying character. so when I sit down and write, they're traps in this croft, right? So there's not an awful lot to be doing in terms of changing the scene or whatever. A lot of my early sort of working with the characters was then just sort of sitting around drinking cups of tea and focusing on those elements of their relationship, which are kind of the little aggressions, the little microaggressions, and the way that they've kind of been playing each other, pushing each other's buttons a little bit. But it was always Whitney who was always the slightly more annoying one and the slightly more sort of sure of himself. And I think it was that element around him which was there from page one, the first scene I ever wrote, and that inevitably meant that I was immediately on Ina's side a little bit. I wanted to see how she was going to deal with this sort of this character, who she's been married to for like 25 years, and I think they weren't always like that as well. So they've obviously got quite a lot of history behind them. But Aina as well, when I got into writing about Aina, she was very quickly like the more active. So it's just so much more enjoyable to write someone who is going to be testing things and pushing limits and things like that. So she was that. She brought that element to the book. Like I said in the intro, so they've been there for 12 years. They've been kept in this croft. They can't leave this island because they're tethered by a pill clog. But things start going awry. Like shipwrecks have started coming up. They've lost contact with the warden and things like that. So they have a real sense of things are starting to unwind beyond beyond the border. But playing off against that is this idea that it's been flagged to them that at some point during the course of their imprisonment, they're going to be tested, and it'll be tailored for them, this test. So yeah, there ends up being this kind of dynamic between them where Aina is looking to escape and Whitney is a lot more, let's just sit tight. And the characters themselves were very much, I leaned a little bit on some of the sculptures that Anthony Gormley had kind of put together. So when I started writing it, I was living in Norwich, and at the time, Anthony Gormley's figures from another place were kind of touring around the world. I think they still are. They're probably dotted around all over right now. And these figures are life-size. They're casts of his body, and you see them cropping up in all kinds of places, curious places and mundane places, and sometimes quite beautiful places. But they brought 3 of them to Norwich, and they were at the university. And I don't know if you know, if you've seen the university, the building itself, or the buildings, are really quite sort of concrete heavy. There's a lot of like concrete walkways, and it's quite brutalist. But it's all the way out of the city, but it's on the edge by the Broads. So there's meadows and there's a lake, and it's quite green. it's a real contrast. The first of these figures that I saw had been positioned on top of the literature building, was looking all the way out, was looking towards the horizon, down towards the lake. The second one was hidden almost on this covered walkway by the library. And, you'd walk past these, you'd glimpse them, you'd see the one on top of the building from half a mile away, and you'd be like, kind of freak you out a little bit. But that was quite a kind of talking point at the university at the time. And, I just started thinking about what their relationships would be. And they had such distinct characters. And there was a third one, which I never saw. So I had this kind of like, what is this strange dynamic between these two characters, and there's potentially a third one who's somewhere hidden. So that kind of overlaid a little bit of my approach to the character.
I think I prefer Whitney, but that's just me. Maybe it is a little bit annoying and I'm a little bit annoying. I don't know. I just think there's a lot kind of going on there. And I really like it in the beginning as well, because we get to see more of Aina, and we don't really know what's going on with Whitney, and I quite like that. I think as well, just speaking of characters, like the island itself, we were talking about this idea of a prison, the island itself is quite like chilling, and there's a beauty to it, and it does really feel like a character in its own right. And I just wondered, like, where did you draw inspiration from, or how did you kind of conjure up that image of this island?
Yeah, a really good question. I think there's elements which were like clearly research, but I think I mentioned before, like loving Moors, maybe not loving, kind of love and terror of Moors. So it kind of came to a head. My brother took me on a really obnoxiously long hike, and it ended up like being 8 a.m. to sort of late at night in the middle of March. And it was actually in the Peak District. So I think it was around like Snake Pass and Bleaklow and around there, if you know. And anyway, it was just the longest hike that would never ever end. It just kept getting longer and longer. It just kept on adding kilometers on. And by the end of it, we were sort of hiking along by these reservoirs in the dark with head torches on, kind of almost slightly tripping out a little bit. And it just, this idea of, not really knowing when something would end, and kind of bringing that to the moor. I mentioned earlier that idea of just not knowing, not being able to measure distance, and measuring things. Obviously, with a title like Metronome, measuring things becomes important for them, and it's really important for Aina particularly. They've got this pill clock which releases their pills. They've got to take these pills to be able to sort of survive out there. They've got to take them every 8 hours. So it really, it forces them to kind of be very aware of their surroundings. If they travel for 4 hours across the other side of the island, they've got to know exactly what the weather's going to be doing on the return journey. Otherwise, they get stuck. The same way, if they get stuck and they break a leg or something like that, they're going to be in real trouble. So the way that I went about writing it, and this might sound a little bit weird, but it's written in third person, but in my mind, I was kind of writing it from the perspective of the croft a lot of the time. So it was kind of just, the croft was almost gravitating towards Aina a little bit. She took Aina under his wing. But the way that I tried to present the land and the landscape, the weather, the sea, it would always be in response to, what is Aina seeing here, and not only what is she seeing, but what does it mean to her? So if there was an observation which doesn't actually mean anything, I try to keep them way out of it. If she sees raindrops on the glass on the window, that's got to mean something. Otherwise, we're not going to hear about it. So I think that's the way that I try to approach the land and approach the landscape in the book. That obviously came from, there was a bit of research. I went out, dug some peat on the Isle of Lewis. That was an experience getting to really kind of feel the texture of it and everything. But as well, like various trips here and there, moors, Bodmin Moor, Rannoch Moor up in Scotland as well. And there was a couple of years when I lived in Japan, in the north of Japan, and it's not really more country, thank God. But I was living on like the end of a peninsula, and you know the sea would ice over in the winter and stuff like that. So I was there for 2 years, and I saw a couple of winters there, and that sort of experience in the wind, living in that environment, definitely filtered through. I don't know if you can hear banging upstairs, but I've got. I think the kids are excited for bar time right now, so that's coming through.
It's fine. I was looking underneath the desk and I was like, is this my dog? Is this she's just looking at me really sadly from the floor, so we're all good. No, I think that's fascinating as well, and it's really skillfully done. Like a lot of the sort of information that we get, it's very subtle, but it's very precise. And I really do. It's really visual, and the idea of the pill clock I find really fascinating, because it really does tether the both of them, Whitney and Aina, to this island. Like they can only go so far. It actually inhibits their free movement of actually being able to move around and explore and see, is it an island or what's going on? Yeah. Seeing different things, which is brilliant. I'm really interested to hear this question, because in my mind I'm reading it and I'm thinking, oh, maybe there's reference to this or reference to that. But are there any writers that kind of inspire you? And if so, could you tell us about them?
Yeah, I think when it comes to this book specifically, I mentioned Orwell. I think Orwell is definitely there. There's a totalitarian element to it as well, off the island, which kind of lends to that. I think otherwise, I wanted to, with this book, wanted to write something quite slow and quite have a sense of dread in it. So thinking about that and thinking about sorts of things I was reading at the time, I remember it was around the time that a book called Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin came out and translated, I think, by Megan McDowell. And I remember reading that, and it's saturated with this weird sense of what is going on here, and it's so beautifully done, and it's done with such sort of minimalist sort of brushstrokes. It's a lot in dialogue, and it's a very skinny book. And I remember just reading that and being absolutely bowled over, and just sort of taking from that an idea. I would love to be able to sort of control things in a manner which would go some way to kind of try and replicate that sense of dread, that sense of unease. And so with Metronome, there's a lot of what we see in a lot of, especially in the first part of the book, it's quite normal life, like we see them going about their life and how they've managed. But I wanted to kind of just puncture that image every once in a while with just, hang on, something's really not quite right here.
Yeah, and I think there's little moments, especially like you get the pill clock kind of, the color, and them to be independent on that, and these little things that they see, and with the Warden and all these things which really do kind of puncture it. So I do think there's a nice contrast there with that. I'm also fascinated. I think it was inevitable that I was going to ask about this, was about the sheep. Can you tell us a bit more about this, like how that came about, what it means to the story?
Yeah, so I didn't want the book to be just the two of them sat in a room. So I was really was looking for a way to begin this book in a slightly uncanny way. And around, during the writing of it, we drove up to Skye, and we'd taken like the train to Glasgow, and then we'd driven from Glasgow to Skye. So we'd been driving all day long, basically. And we were like probably half an hour from our destination. And we're all kind of knackered. There's a lot of us in the car, and my wife Jen was driving, and it was a really, really beautiful sort of June sunset, sun going down, water, mountain coming down, the roads just going really, really straight, and a line of sheep are coming at us on the other side of the road in the opposite direction. So we're going that way, they're coming towards us. So Jen like slows right down, and they come and they start passing, and there's probably like 10 of them, and the very, very last one, like the little, like, I don't know, the runty one, just decides to just veer off into the lane and like charge the front of the van, and it bounced off and kind of shook itself down, and then we're like, oh god, is this sheep going to be all right? So we had a bit of a rude awakening to our sort of our time in Skye, sorting out this sheep, and then we was like, okay, let's put it behind us and carry on with our week away. And the very next morning, of course, like it was like something out of a B movie when they go downstairs and they open the back door, the kitchen door, and up at the gate there's like a sheep just like looking, just staring at you. And it was the freakiest thing. And I love that. I mean, I love that idea of just very sort of mundane things, everyday things, which are somehow turned around into becoming out of place. So, this sheep they've been there 12 years. They've never once seen a sheep. So the appearance of the sheep at the beginning of the novel really kind of sets things in train a little bit. They're wondering how it got there, and but of course, for the rest of our holiday, like whenever we saw a sheep, it would just like stand in the middle of the path and just wouldn't move. So it's terrifying.
I think that actually translates as well into the book, because there's moments where you feel like the sheep knows almost what's going on, or the way that it's narrated, it almost sounds like they're in on whatever is happening, which I find fascinating. I think one of the lines that sticks with me, or definitely one of the lines that sticks with me, is for some reason at the end of the second chapter, I think it was, where you said, I can't remember if it was Whitney or Aina that said it, but they say, do sheep swim? And I've always thought about that, and I was meant to write this down and look it up. I'm not sure if you know the answer to that. You don't have to answer if you don't know, but I'm fascinated if would a sheep actually swim?
I don't know if it's not really a spoiler. So I'm sure there's probably two trains of thought on this, probably. I think they can swim short distances.
Yeah, I would imagine that, yeah.
That's my stock answer.
And I know that we're going to have a lot of budding sort of writers as well, and aspiring writers. And I'm just wondering, can you tell us a little bit about, because we've talked a little bit about Metronome and kind of how that started for you. Can you tell us about your sort of writing journey and that journey sort of to publication?
Yeah. So yeah, I'd love to. For me, when it came like with writing, writing was always something that was I was really keen on, and never really. It sounds really like obvious, but I never really knew how to get into writing. And in the end, it was, I think at the time, this is sort of 12, 13 years ago, at the time, like the Paris Review interviews were all unlocked, and you could just go and read as many of the Paris Review interviews for free. So I read a bunch of those, and I remember reading as well, like Stephen King's autobiography. And I think, a lot of people talk about that in terms of helping them get started, or refer to it just in terms of helping them on their way. And I found that really just chimed a little bit. One thing out of the Paris Review interviews, I remember just reading, I think it was like J.G. Ballard, and I haven't read an awful lot of J.G. Ballard, but I was kind of just fascinated by his kind of slightly mundane life in South London with a bunch of kids, and just sort of, I think he had like 5 kids, and just being in that environment, I'm sure he probably had all kinds of issues going on, but being able to kind of just sit down and churn it out and get it done, I think like that was the kind of the thing that I took away from that. So I started by setting myself a sort of a small little target of trying to write like 1 short story per month for a year. And I'd obviously I'd had things that I'd tried to work on and things I tried to get off the ground. And I think oftentimes, I just wouldn't go back and look at them when I'd finished. I never really finished something properly. So I probably had, loose first drafts of stuff filling up a drawer somewhere, but was too terrified to go back and confront as to how bad they might be. And the On Writing book by Stephen King was kind of good at just sort of saying, come on, don't be so afraid, like get in there and edit. So that was really good. So I did my year's worth of short stories and started sending them out. And I think the thing for me was just the act of sending something out was just the possibility of something. It was tremendous. It was like, that would be a real buzz for the rest of the week. You've got something out and who knows what it might bring. And yeah, it was a real buzz to do that. And then at the time I was you know, I was living in South London, and I got to know a few writers, and I started nagging them to let me come to their events and like read my rubbish and stuff like that. And it was some wincy moments that I have in memory. But I think that element of, you know, just being able to build an element of community and an element of like friendships and support was really, really helpful. And I think to an extent, most writers probably rely on that to an extent.
Yeah, I think as well, it is very daunting for someone that's kind of thinking, how do I get into this? I see the books in the bookshelves, but like, what do I need, an agent or publisher, and that kind of thing. And I think that's really good advice, is like maybe start with short stories, or if you enjoy writing poetry, that's always like a good way, because it kind of gets the creative energy going. But then obviously, like you said, submitting something makes it kind of, there's the idea of the hope there, but there's an idea of accomplishment there as well, where sometimes I know when I write, if I'm writing a novel, sometimes halfway through I'm like, oh, I just want to put this in a drawer, forget, you know, it's a long process and a long sort of commitment in many ways.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's probably, there is the hope, and then there is also just, there is dealing with the disappointment as well. And I think it's a real challenge sometimes to deal with it, and you get knocks, and you know, still get knocks about stuff. We'll always get knocks about stuff, and we'll always like sit down in the morning now and be like frustrated nothing's happening. So I think the hardest thing that I'm still learning is just dealing with that sense of it never goes away, that sort of challenge. It never becomes a walk in the park or something like that. And I think if it did, then I'd probably need to write something else.
No, I totally agree with that, and I do think what you were saying about the writing group or the writers group as well is a really good one, because that kind of, you've got that motivation, and it's not such a solitary activity then, you know.
Yeah.
That support and that circle around you, which is fantastic. I've got two more questions, so if anyone wants to pop their questions, we do have a number of questions in the Q&A at the moment, so you won't be listening to me blather on for much longer, but yeah, if you have any questions in there and you're listening to us, just pop them in there and I will ask them at the end of the chat. I just wanted to get an idea, because we do a lot of work at the reading agency with libraries, and I'm sure there are quite a few librarians that are listening, so I just wanted to know what libraries meant, or what libraries mean to you.
Yeah, I think, like, for me growing up, libraries were a great place. You know, I'd spend my sort of Saturday afternoons. My local library is in Ruislip in Hillingdon, and it's this really, it's like, do you know it?
Sorry, a side note, my best friend moved to Ruislip for a number of years, so that's kind of wild. So I literally used to go to Ruislip for about 3 years, every second weekend. So yeah, anyway, sorry.
it is like the most beautiful library. I'm sure it's got, you know, there's that one in Buenos Aires, and, you know, ones around the world which probably could be, but it's a really gorgeous old building, and, you know, in a barn, and it's, you know, being in there as a kid and going down to the little children's library and finding your books and taking them home and reading them, like, that's my earliest memory of libraries. By the time I was a teenager, though, I was kind of like, I was rollerblading up and down the ramp outside and getting in trouble. And when I actually moved back, I live in Ruislip again now. I moved back a couple of years ago, and I've seen that they've like blocked off the ramp, so you can no longer do your jumps at the end of the ramp, which is probably a good thing for everybody concerned. But yeah, the libraries themselves, though, you know, Ruislip was a wonderful place to go. And then when I lived in South London, I used to go to the Brixton Library a lot. Really, really lovely place. And I think it's just, you know, it's just a place to be, and, you know, librarians are just so knowledgeable and so helpful. For me, just growing up, it's just always a beautiful place to go.
I think as well, it's like, I agree with everything you've said. I always just remember being able to go in and having the choice, like having that freedom to choose what you wanted, and no one sort of, because like I felt like at school it was like, oh, this is what we're going to read, and you didn't really have any agency in your decision, or to be able to kind of shape what it was that you wanted to read.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You know, when you start wandering down the out of the kiddie section, and or into the slightly older sort of stuff. I remember reading like Adrian Mole before I probably should have, and like there's definitely like sections out of that which have absolutely imprinted on my brain. But yeah, getting into all sorts, I think that's such a wonderful thing, libraries.
I think I was always a Goosebumps kid, and I was reading them from about like 8. I think I might have been a little bit too young, like on the cusp of 8. And I just loved them. I was also like, I was quite young for my year by about a year and a half. So everyone else was like, we're reading Goosebumps. And I was like, I'm reading Goosebumps. It was like mob mentality. I'll ask. Go ahead, sorry.
I was like, my guilty secret was always like the Hardy Boys books. Do you know the Hardy Boys? Like
I know them, but I've never read them.
The two American detectives, yeah, shamefully. But I remember one day, it was like a very early version of like World Book Day, and you could come to school dressed as your like favorite character or whatever. So I took this very seriously in going to school as one of the Hardy Boys, but it did mean that I was wearing like trainers, jeans, and a t-shirt. And when I got to school, I got no end of stick for my costume, which I thought was properly appropriate. And you know, I mean, obviously, it didn't look anything next to all the Dorothys and everything like that. But yeah.
I need to add this to my list. I can't believe I've never read the Hardy Boys. Actually, I think as a child, well, as a child, as a like late teen, I always loved reading the Skullduggery Pleasant books. You know, the skeleton on the front, the skeleton detective. I don't know why. I think it's because he's Irish and I have the same sense of humor, and I just thought it was wild. I just love them. I'll ask the last question, which is, what are you working on next? If you're allowed to tell us what that might be.
So I am working on something. It is a novel, but it's also in its quite early stages. So it's a little bit difficult to talk about. But I can say that it's a story of a group of engineers who think that they may have uncovered a portal to something. They're not quite sure where it leads. So it ends up, a look at the kind of the impact that this has on their relationships, their friendships, their family, and this kind of uncertainty as to what's behind the door.
I was just going to say, I think you need to hurry up and write it, to be honest.
You're too kind.
Quit the day job, just write.
I know.
What we'll do is we'll take some questions now. So we've got quite a few. Some of these are going to be relating back to other questions, I think, when I probably should have just stopped and asked you these along the way. But you mentioned 1984 as an inspiration of sorts. Were there any other books or films that you think may have influenced your idea for the story?
I mean, in terms of the idea, I think, I'm sure there are some, and I think probably when it comes to sort of writing about people in like dealing with the elements and dealing with exposure and things like that, I remember there's a couple of Annie Proulx short stories where that sort of theme really comes true. And in a weird way as well, this is going to be obscure, but there's True Grit by Charles Cortis, which I don't know if you know, but it's a Western. And it's about this little girl who goes off and tries to track down her father's murderer. But there's elements in that where some of the tension and some of the excitement is, I definitely had that in mind at various points when, the book Metronome, it starts fairly slowly, but I always wanted it to kind of escalate, to take that kind of curve. So there are those points that definitely do feed in. One thing for me as well, when it with this book, it's written in the third person, it's present tense, and time and everything is obviously like a very big theme. And there is this graphic novel by this guy called Richard Maguire. It's called Home, and it's the most like transporting thing I've read in so long. And it's basically just a double page spread, and each double page spread is the same location, and it's sometimes it's sort of a house, sometimes it's a field. It's the same spot in time, and it's all these various little stories that crop up in little panels around the page. And the way that that novel tells stories about memory and place, and how the past sort of entwines in weird ways with the present, that was a real sort of inspiration. And it was such a trip, that book. I wish I could go back and just like reread it.
It's called Home by Richard
Maguire's. I actually have it. Oh no, sorry, it's not called Home. It's called Here.
Here. Okay, I'm gonna write that one down. Quickly, Richard Maguire.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. I've just popped, so just for everyone else, I've popped 2 links into the chat. The first one is for the hardback for Metronome, if you want to have a look at that. The second one is for the paperback, which you can pre-order, which is out on the 30th, which is only in 3 days' time. So if you want to grab a copy of the paperback, which you can see, oh well, it's behind Tom. Yeah, there we go. And then this is, oh gosh, I'm about to knock it over. And then there's the paperback, or sorry, the hardback. Oh, more coffee. So I'll look at the next question. So I was fascinated by your economy of language. Is this your default style, or was it a conscious choice to match the setting and the situation?
Yeah, precisely the latter. I think I think when it comes to style, it was very much this is what this book needs. So straight away, when I was thinking about where it's going to be set, and the sort of the nature of of Aina particularly, the way that she's quite closed off, the way that she interacts with Whitney, like it was always going to be a fairly sort of minimalist, very sort of detail specific book, but also with a sense of rhythm in it. And actually, there's one element which I've never actually mentioned before, but when it came to writing about it, so throughout the whole book, I didn't use any contractions, so I didn't use any apostrophes except within dialogue, and that was like a completely sort of a choice. I just wanted the words to be as they are. I didn't want any kind of rushing, and I wanted to really get that sort of sense of rhythm coming through the language. There's a few things as you read it, you'll that crop up, these kind of mantras that Aina say. She's a musician as well, so she's got this ear for sounds and rhythm and tempo and everything. So although it is quite minimalist, those were the sorts of things that I was playing with.
Thank you so much for that. We've had some, I'm just picking out the ones that we haven't answered. Oh, this is a good question. I quite like this one. It's fine. It's not hard. It's fine. Don't need to look nervous. So how did it feel when the book was being released into the wild? And then also, how did it feel when it was selected for Between the Covers? Congratulations, by the way. It's a brilliant book.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, all those things have been absolutely amazing. And it is still sort of, goosebump territory to sort of just think about it, to that it exists as a book still gives me like immense pleasure. In terms of finding an agent, I did, back in the days of still writing short stories, but back in the early days, I kind of did a lot of research on who I'd like to reach out to, and who I think, who's representing the kind of people that I like to read and things like that. And I started making approaches and things. But whilst I was at UEA for a year, my agent, Carolina Sutton, ended up coming to visit and giving a talk, and that's where I met her for the first time. And I'd submitted a few things to her previously, so I was like, hello. But she ended up seeing some early pages of Metronome and getting in touch on that. And so yeah, that was like an absolute highlight. And from there, it wasn't a quick book to read. So from that to the point where it went out on submission was probably about 3 years. And it went out on submission I think it was, I can't remember which year it was, whether it was 21, it must have been 20. It was during the first year of lockdown, so 20, right? The sort of summer of 2020, and I've never been more nervous when it went out to various editors. So to get to get some interest from Bloomsbury, and just once I sat down with Bloomsbury and had a little chat with Emma, who's my editor, and just sort of to have that conversation with someone who is just like on board with your book was the dream. Like, it was just absolutely blown away by it. So that, yeah, I mean, I'm kind of gushing on a little bit. They're all amazing things, and I feel incredibly lucky that they've all come off between the covers as well. Like, yeah, astonishing. And it's been a real help for the book as well to find a readership.
No, definitely, and both incredible accomplishments. And I think as well, it's interesting just when you're mentioning your agent and how that happened, because I think a lot of people that, I mean, like I write as well and publish, but I think a lot of people think that like, oh, you know, like with the agent, like that they have to like me, but actually you've got to like them as well, because you want that relationship as well to last, and you want that to be a very transparent and honest relationship. So it's really, really good that you've got that.
Yeah, I mean, there are some, I feel lucky to have Carolina in my corner. Like, it's a lot about personalities, and there's a professional element to it as well, for me. So she's great. She's the absolute best.
Thank you so much for that. We've got another comment here that you've already answered this question, but I just want to read out the comment that they're joining from Essex. It's been so fun to listen to you, and love hearing about hearing everything behind the story, and really enjoyed reading Metronome. It was just they were going to ask about what you're working on next. I feel like I jumped the gun. I probably should have taken these questions throughout. This one is quite interesting, and I'll be curious to know as well. So have you ever struggled with writer's block when you're writing? And if so, how do you kind of manage this, or do you have any tips for maintaining discipline when you're writing?
I mean, I find it, sometimes I find it very difficult. So it just, in terms of like my own writing, right? I've always got up early in the morning, and I would write before work, got my day job and everything like that. So I quickly, once I picked up, started writing my short stories, the only time that I really had to do it was getting up at stupid o'clock in the morning. And for a long time, that's been the way that I write. I'm now finding that it's becoming harder and harder to get up in the morning and write. So I go through periods where it's not really working, or there's just, too many things going on with the kids, all wonderful distractions. But I think the things that I tell myself, like, just do it little and often, every day, every other day, whatever. It's just, I try not to be too hard on myself about it, because I'm not going to be able to sort of sit here for sort of 2 hours a day every day and crank it out. But there's other ways. So I think I try to be as flexible as possible. I try to write wherever I can. And that's one of the things that kind of attracted me to writing in the first place, was that it is really sort of, you can be really mobile with it. And I think it's weird, because I need some element of routine, but at the same time, there's got to be flexibility within it. So I think, that's the only thing that I could say. I mean, in terms of writer's block, there were periods when I was writing Metronome when, I had the first half of the book written, and I knew exactly how it was going to end, and there was a big sort of chasm.
I was going to say chasm, actually. It's funny that you say it.
I was going to get from there to there. And I mean, in some of it was just like, I went, like a month or two without working on it, would try and work on something else, would come back, would think, maybe this is it, would write something for, a month or so. No, that didn't work, go away again. And it basically took about a year or so to kind of fill that gap in. So yeah, I think obviously the things like persistence, there is always an answer. It's just a matter of finding the best answer and having a you know, you can't wait forever for the answer to come. At some point, you just need to choose what it's going to be and just go with that.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say every time that I've tried to wake up early to write, I've almost been late for work. And he shouldn't say this because this is recorded for everybody in my organization to hear. I feel like I'm up. Hello, meeting, 9 o'clock. I don't know what it is. Like, I can go out on a walk and stuff like that, but the minute I get up to write, I'm just not 100% there. I'm in like an evening. I'm like a night owl.
Yeah. So weirdly, I feel like this book that I'm writing, this is going to sound weird, but it feels more like an evening book, whereas Metronome was very much like still, empty, and it was very easy to sort of just wake up and be in a very quiet house and just be like slip into that mode. And I feel like this book is a bit more noisier, like it's a bit more sort of like it's an evening, there's a bit of a music coming through a wall or something like that. It needs that element. So yeah, I think I'm gonna have to reorganize things in my writing schedule.
I think it was interesting as well when you were talking about writing one short story per month for a year. That's like a really good method. And I don't want to sound as crass as to call a short story like a sort of sorbet of sorts, but in some ways working on something a little bit smaller, whether it's a piece of flash fiction or a short story or a poem, might actually be really good as well in terms of like taking you away from something that feels maybe in that moment and in your mindset a bit unmanageable, to kind of feel that sense of accomplishment when you finish something, because you don't have to submit it if you don't want to, but you've done something that's, I suppose, creative and you know, it's a bit more manageable in that moment.
That's 100%. I think, you know, as soon as you stop focusing on the problem in front of you, like oftentimes that's when something is just gonna release in the back of your mind and the answer or the way forward will present itself. I think as well, like like going for a walk, like it's amazing. And I feel like there's been a few books on it lately about, you know, writers or artists who go for walks and the beauty of going for a walk. So, but it kind of, I kind of think it's really important, like just to have, you know, if you can just go for a walk for half an hour and just clear your head, just the act of moving, or, you know, the act of just being outside, being in a different environment, just does something to release it.
No, definitely. I'm not sure if this is the best way, the best sort of exercise for writer's block, but sometimes I imagine I'm on the waltzers and I stop and I write what I see and then try and see if I can weave it together, which is quite interesting. But yeah, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it's a different way of, I suppose, tackling a different perspective.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if you want to talk too much about this one, but I'm going to, like, as in to give away spoilers or anything like that. But the context of the two characters' crime is so frightening. How did you come up with the sort of background behind that? Or how did you kind of come about that?
So, I mean, I don't want to go into too much detail about their crime, because I think there's an element of it which is covered in various reviews. So, I mean, it does involve, you know, control of people's bodies. They've come from a place where choices are not given freely to everybody as we would sort of see them or experience them to some extent here. So in that regard, you know, I think looking around at politics in the last sort of like 5 years, beyond Trump coming in the States, everything here, it was very much sort of just having a sense of certain liberties being taken away, certain choices over people's bodies being removed from, you know, from the individuals themselves, and having a very sort of real sense of kind of distaste as to what was happening there. So for anyone who hasn't read the book, that maybe just sounds like a lot of vague garbling. Hopefully it makes a little bit of sense.
No, I think it's good as well. That's why I was kind of trying to frame that, because I don't want it to kind of ruin anything or spoil anything for people that haven't kind of got the book. Yeah. There's quite a similar question here about sort of your advice on planning, writing, and editing. Maybe it might be interesting to hear about like how you go about planning your ideas, or did you have an idea in mind for Metronome?
Yeah.
Maybe if you wanted to touch on how you kind of approach editing, or when you finish that draft.
Yeah, so Metronome, it started out as a dissertation. So it's my dissertation on the MA I was doing, which was really freeing in the way that I knew, I knew I was just going to be writing basically the first quarter of a book, and that's what I had in mind. So I was very much like, I just need to throw all these things up in the air, and I don't have to care about how they land. So I knew exactly where we were going to get off, and I knew about how to get there. So that it was great for getting things going. Just writing without any sort of destination in mind, not worrying too much about how it's all going to come together. But like I kind of mentioned earlier, like it did leave me having to go through quite a lot of drafts to make the book hang together in a way that I liked, that I wanted, that I felt like brought out the themes in the way that I wanted to. I'm doing a little bit of the opposite at the minute, where I'm planning quite a lot at the minute. And I think probably my happy medium would be somewhere in between. I feel like right now I've got probably 80% of this book in my head, and I've got 20% at the end where I'm like, it's either going to be this, or this, like sort of three or four options. And I feel like if I had the whole thing nailed down and so clear in my head, then it would be a lot harder to write. So I've got to keep something back in order to get there, to work out what makes sense. In terms of editing, I love editing. The best thing is the first draft, when you've had a good day, when I've had a good morning and written a good amount of words, and it feels like they're not terrible words. That's brilliant. Or when you unlock something which has kind of been holding up the narrative or the next chapter or something. For me, those always, like, the feeling of triumph is hard to match. But I love the kind of like the quiet business of editing, where you're just kind of doing little bits of orchestration and aligning things. If that's when I think the language really takes on a little bit of it all starts to make sense a little bit. So yeah, I love the editing for that.
I love editing, but I hate planning. Like, I hate it. I'm just like, we'll just see what happens. For the best. I remember an agent said to me once, oh, can I see an outline? And I was just like, I don't know how to respond to this, but basically the answer is no.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. Like, I did, like, when I was, I wrote a paper once on, this is obscure, so it has a point. I wrote this paper once on Waterland by Graham Swift, which is like set in the fens and deals with time and all those kind of things in history, and the way that time comes back around and things come to the surface. And so I loved Waterland when I read it, and I got really into it, and I ended up like doing all the timelines and charts and things like that, just to see what it would look like. And I like freely admit that I've done the same thing for Metronome, and I've done all sorts of plotting about this arc and this character and what's the level of this and that compared to this. And I've made lots of like very prissy graphs that probably don't mean anything if I show it to anybody, but it was kind of fun for me to sort of, if I got to a point in the book where I was like, this bit feels like it's missing something, and to sort of see things in a slightly visual way.
Yeah.
See what the gap might be.
No, that's amazing. That's really interesting. So I've never been, I'm a visual reader, but when it comes to actually drawing things or illustrating things, it's just, that's where my talents end.
I think it was partly procrastination though. I think that's what was what drew me to doing those kind of things.
That's a fair point, yeah. What I'm going to do is I've got a little survey to ask people to fill in. I've got one more question, but I'm going to pop it into the chat. So if you are all watching and able to, I promise it won't take longer than 5 minutes. Like max, it'll take 5 minutes. If you could just fill that out at the end, it'd be very much appreciated. And the last question is, let me just bring them up. Was there a book that you read in childhood that really, like, did you have a favorite book as a child, or what was your favorite book as a child? Or do you remember?
Gosh, I mean, like, yeah, it's really hard to nail down just one. I mean, The Hobbit was like a real big part of growing up, and then I think there were times as well, like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe stuff. You know, going through that wardrobe was like really magical. Yeah, those were two. I'm trying to think, going back even further, Where the Wild Things Are. Those books were, well, that book, those pictures, and to be able to do like 4 pages in a children's book where there's like no words, I thought it was, you know, I've obviously been reading it recently as well, but yeah, pretty special, pretty good book.
I love The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Just the idea of something so normal leading somewhere so fantastical.
Yeah,
it's like a classic.
And the lamp. There's something about that lamp which is just tremendously like mundane, but also uncanny. Seeing that lamp through the snow. Yeah.
I feel like I read the book though, and I feel like now that I've watched the film, all I can think about is Tilda Swinton, which is probably not what you should be thinking about when you think of the book. I just now when I read the book, I just see her.
Yeah.
She's brilliant. If anyone else has a last question, we could squeeze it in. I think I've gone through all the questions. No. Thank you so much for joining me, Tom.
Thank you.
And just to reiterate as well, if you go into the chat, everybody, I've posted the links. The first link is for the hardback of Metronome, and the second link is for the paperback, which is out on the 30th of March. So do go check them out, buy a copy, and I promise you'll absolutely love it. Thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a lovely evening. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye-bye.
Thanks all. Bye.